Welcome to this HP Video Technical Configuration Guide. In this video, we're discussing the configuration of PVST or per VLAN spanning tree and rapid PVST Plus on HP ProVision and Cisco switches. This TCG consists of two parts. In the first part, there's an overview of PVST configuration on HP ProVision and Cisco switches, including guidelines and command explanations. A brief overview of show commands that can be used to test interoperability is also covered. The second part is a practical demonstration of the setup, configuration, and testing of rapid PVST on HP ProVision and Cisco switches. For a quick overview, continue viewing Part 1 and then go to Part 2 if you want to see a practical demonstration of rapid PVST working between HP ProVision switches and Cisco switches. This is our topology. We have two ProVision switches, ProVision 1 and ProVision 2. We also have two Cisco switches, Cisco 1 and Cisco 2. We are going to configure ProVision 1 as the root for VLANs 1, 3, and 5. Cisco 1 will be configured as the root for VLANs 2 and 4. That will allow load sharing of traffic. VLAN 3 traffic will use this uplink, VLAN 2 traffic this uplink, VLAN 5, and lastly VLAN 4 this uplink. User traffic is thus load shared across the uplinks by changing the priorities of the core switches for specific VLANs. The devices used in this topology are two HP 3800 series switches, J9585A, in other words 3800 24G 2XGs, running operating system KA150900012. The Cisco switches are two 3750s running IP services 12.255SE3. Some guidelines with regards to spanning tree. Spanning tree is not enabled by default on HP ProVision switches. When spanning tree is enabled, the default spanning tree used is multiple spanning tree. Cisco devices use PVST or rapid PVST by default. Rapid PVST is backward compatible with PVST. Please refer to the device release notes for specific versions that support PVST. The number of VLANs that PVST can maintain instances for depends on the switch model. That may be limited, for instance, to 128 instances, which will thus limit the number of VLANs that PVST can support on ProVision switches. Please refer once again to the release notes. Cisco PVST costs are different to multiple spanning tree costs, and thus the long method should be configured for consistency in a Cisco environment. That often will not be done, however, and thus the HP switches will be using higher costs than the Cisco switches. So when should you use PVST in a Cisco and HP environment? In general, best practices avoid the use of any spanning tree in a large LAN because of the long convergence times. A better choice would be to use IRF in a large campus environment. If spanning tree is deployed, multiple spanning tree is the best choice for VLAN load balancing. PVST is thus only recommended when integrating ProVision-based switches into an already existing PVST implementation. If you have a Cisco environment running PVST or rapid PVST and need to integrate HP switches into that environment, then PVST would be a good choice. PVST is based on the IEEE 802.1d spanning tree standard with additional proprietary extensions. Rapid PVST is based on the IEEE 802.1w standard with additional proprietary extensions. So both PVST and rapid PVST are Cisco proprietary protocols. Cisco does also implement the industry standard multiple spanning tree. Unlike spanning tree and rapid spanning tree, whose bridges in a LAN must forward their VLAN packets in the same spanning tree, PVST and rapid PVST allow for each VLAN to build a separate spanning tree. There are spanning tree instances on a per VLAN basis in PVST and rapid PVST, whereas in the industry standard spanning tree or 802.1d or rapid spanning tree, only a single instance is configured. ProVision switches are configured to use rapid PVST and Comware to use PVST, but both operating systems support PVST and rapid PVST. Be aware that Cisco switches, when running PVST or rapid PVST, do not implement the industry standard costs. The defaults on Cisco switches are 19 for fast Ethernet, 4 for gigabit, 2 for 10 gigabit, whereas the industry standard is 200,000, 20,000, and 2,000. HP ProVision switches follow the industry standard values. To enable Cisco switches to use industry standard costs, use the command spanning tree path cost method long. By default, the short method is used, which means that the costs are 19, 4, and 2, rather than 200,000, 20,000, and 2,000. HP ProVision switches do follow the industry standard values. So best practice would say set all the switches to use the same values. A word of warning about DTP or Dynamic Trunk Protocol. DTP is a Cisco proprietary protocol used to auto-negotiate trunk encapsulation and trunk setup between two Cisco switches. HP switches do not support DTP. If a Cisco switch is unable to negotiate trunking by using DTP, it will configure the port as an access port. If a BPDU is then received on a non-trunk port, the port will go to an inconsistent state. And if you type show spanning tree on the Cisco switch, you may see a message such as follows: blocking point-to-point type INC. This means that the port is in the broken state because of an inconsistency. In this case, type inconsistent. To prevent this, hard code trunk ports and turn off DTP. So as an example, the encapsulation is set to .1Q. The permitted VLANs or allowed VLANs are 1 to 5. The port is manually configured as a trunk and DTP is turned off. If you type show spanning tree on a Cisco switch and see this message, it may be because DTP has not been able to negotiate properly, so turn it off. To enable rapid spanning tree on a ProVision switch, type enable conft spanning tree mode rapid PVST. To configure priorities for various VLANs, use the command spanning tree VLAN, in this example 1, 3, and 5, and set the priority. In this case, the priority is set to 0. For other VLANs, say 2 and 4, the priority is set to 1, which means 4096. The value here is multiplied by 4096. Then enable spanning tree. The show spanning tree command will show you that spanning tree is enabled on this device and provide other output. To enable edge ports or portfast ports, use the command spanning tree, specify the interfaces, admin edge port. On Cisco, do something similar. Use the command enable conft spanning tree mode rapid PVST. Use extended system IDs, where the priority field consists of the VLAN number and the priority. Configure the priorities for the various VLANs. In this example, these are the opposite of the ProVision configuration. In this case, VLANs 1, 3, and 5 have a priority of 4096, and VLANs 2 and 4 have a priority of 0. To configure Cisco switches to use industry standard costs, you need to type the command spanning tree path cost method long, which is a global configuration command. To enable portfast or edge ports, type the command spanning tree portfast default, which means all access ports are set to portfast mode. As a strategy for implementation, remember that Cisco switches use PVST or rapid PVST by default. No spanning tree is enabled by default on ProVision switches. When spanning tree is enabled, the spanning tree used is multiple spanning tree. You thus need to configure your HP switches to use rapid PVST+. So firstly, configure your HP switches to use rapid PVST+. Check if the Cisco switches are using the industry standard costs. If possible, change the costs on your Cisco switches to use the long method, configure route priorities for load sharing, then enable spanning tree on your HP switches and check your topology. Here are some show commands that can be useful for checking spanning tree on ProVision and Cisco switches. So on ProVision, commands such as show spanning tree or show spanning tree pipe begin route MAC. On Cisco, show spanning tree blocked ports or show spanning tree route or show spanning tree active. Very useful commands for checking spanning tree. That concludes the first part of this TCG explaining the configuration of PVST Plus on HP ProVision and Cisco switches. The next part will continue the discussion with a practical demonstration of the setup of rapid PVST on HP ProVision and Cisco switches.